Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at cesj.org. Hello, welcome back to the Just Third Way podcast. I'm very honored today to have a special guest, Dr. Robert Ashford. Hello, Dr. Ashford.
Hello, how are you?
Well, I'm great, and I'm really honored to have you on the podcast. Everyone pretty much that's been around the movement for a while knows who you are, but I'll go ahead and mention to those who might, not be familiar, maybe new participants, that you are the only college professor who has consistently taught binary economics for years and years. I guess that would be the best, especially in the United States, right?
I think that's correct, and it may actually be in the world. I'm not
Right.
so happy about that. I wish I had a lot of colleagues doing the same thing, but
Absolutely. I agree.
Not many.
Right. And so you're actually a professor of law. You have a law degree. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
It's interesting. I think I had mentioned to you before, I've found that it's almost like people who study and get degrees in economics get so caught up in the status quo method of teaching things that it seems like the ones that have come through law and get law degrees are more likely to understand and endorse binary economics and the just third way and that kind of thinking. Would you agree?
Well, I think there's a special orientation foundation that people acquainted with the law have in connection with this subject. I think it's important to recognize that law and economics at their foundation are really inseparable. That is to say, the legal infrastructure provides the foundation for the economic incentives, and of course, the economic incentives provide the incentive to shape the law. Both those two things are reciprocal, but in some ways, binary economics is as much a theory of private property as it is a theory of economics. And so that gives, I think, law people oriented in the law a certain foundational orientation. The other thing is that since Adam Smith, starting with Adam Smith, economics has made a couple of assumptions that really run contrary to the binary approach. And so if you learn those assumptions and don't bother to question them, you're less likely to see the defects in the approach. Whereas if you start from a law perspective that hasn't made those assumptions, then you're more open to it. But also, I think other disciplines, other people are as well. My experience has been that the people who grasp the innovative aspects of binary economics are not necessarily more intelligent, more educated. I find brilliant, well-educated people who just can't see it, just don't get it,
Right.
and brilliant and educated people who do. And
Right.
I find relatively uneducated people, and even I would say people of average intelligence who don't get it, and then other people of relatively uneducated, meaning to say not advanced, and relatively average
That's been my
intelligence.
experience
They
too.
see it immediately, and there's no prediction as to what it is, except that I do think number one, preconceptions play a role in blinding people, and then a kind of an attitude, a humility to say there may be a better way, and to really
Right.
want that better way. It's an attitudinal issue.
I agree
So
with that.
both of the things are there, and there are many barriers to the recognition of the value of binary economics, many barriers, and they're not all the same, and not all sinister, and they're not all insurmountable. When you come to people with the idea that here's a remarkably um, unrecognized way of achieving great progress, and then people say, well, if it's so remarkable and wonderful, how come it hasn't been already accepted? And the first answer I give to that, it's not the only answer. I said, well, the simplest answer is that it's wrong.
Right.
Of course, it may not be wrong, but that is the simplest answer. And if you don't go beyond the simplest answer, and you assume that we're not resting on false assumptions, then you've got an education that allows you to have a certain kind of arrogance
Right.
if you're not of a humble orientation. And I think that does come to play involved. There's also the question of whether the person psychologically wants to help the economically disadvantaged or blames them for being economically disadvantaged. I mean, they're two
That's very
fundamental
true. There are some people that I
orientations.
sort of categorize as exploiters who like the system because they want to be at the top of it and take advantage of people.
And that's another issue, too. Envy. I mean, the idea of it is said that we are proud of being intelligent, good-looking, and wealthy, but we're not. We're proud of being more intelligent, better-looking, and wealthier. Because if everybody was equally good-looking, intelligent, and wealthy, there'd be nothing to be proud about. So it's the
That's true.
difference that
Exactly.
creates that joy of being better than somebody else. And I think some of the resistance to binary economics comes there too. But I like to think that the biggest reason is that we are burdened by preconceptions, and that most people, if they can shed themselves loose of the preconceptions, will come to appreciate it. And that's been my experience. If you can talk to people,
Right.
another barrier to the idea is that it is not an idea that reads, meaning to say that you can get it from reading it.
Right.
The linear word, one word after another, is not doesn't have the benefit of an oral conversation where you can leap from one place to another. My experience has been there could be 10 or 12 or 15 barriers to understanding binary economics, but not every person has the same problem. One person might have a problem with number 3, and another person might have a problem with number 8. So if you have to go step by step, you're going to get caught somewhere in the process. Whereas if you can
Right.
talk to somebody and say, I see your problem is number 7, let me talk to you about that. Then you can leap to that one, get that one unsnarled, and then move on. And so, one of the ways I teach this idea is by observing that if the eastern horizon is clear, we see the sunrise, and if the western horizon is clear, we see the sunset, and we know scientifically when it'll happen in the year 2513 on September 10th in Washington D.C. We know all that, but it's a complete illusion. The sun doesn't rise and the sun doesn't set. The Earth spins. We'll
Yep.
try to
Just going
explain that
around and
to someone
around.
in try to explain that to someone in writing in 1600, when the
True.
conception of the Earth as the center provided the power justifications for of the authority of the crown and the authority of the church to be the way to tell people how to behave. It wasn't so easy in those years to explain it in writing.
Right.
And I always like to tell people that Galileo had an academic freedom problem. They threatened to burn him at the stake because he didn't conform to the original thinking. You can predict when the sun will rise on September 10th in the year 2513 in any place in the United States.
Right.
Okay, now the reason that's interesting is that many people criticize mainstream economics, and particularly the neoclassical Milton Friedman sort of free market approach to economics, what they call free market, not free
Right.
market, but they call because They criticize it because it rests on unreasonable assumptions. People aren't all rational; they're emotional. You've got ignorance. You've got um, uh, psychological factors. You've got game. There are all sorts of reasons for. And he has a very handsome answer to all of that. He said, "Look, as long as it's predictive, it doesn't matter whether the assumptions are unrealistic because scientists are interested in prediction, and neoclassical economics works." He says, "Of course, they didn't predict the Great Recession. They didn't predict a lot of things, but nevertheless, that's his position. It doesn't matter whether the assumptions are unrealistic." So
Right.
how does that relate? Um, I once observed that the sun doesn't rise; it's a complete illusion. The Earth spins, and I made that reservation to a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry who was what I call a contemporary relativist. Everything's relative.
Okay.
He said, well, you could look at it either way, and I said, wait a minute, Professor. If the
No,
sun
you can't.
if the sun rises around and goes around the Earth, then Newton's laws make no sense.
That's right.
And so what that tells you is that a perfectly predictive system can obscure a more important law. And the more important law is that the broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital promotes fuller employment. So for your audience, we're just talking around the idea. We haven't even said a thing about binary economics, but these are all psychological barriers to a deeper understanding. And there are many
Right.
more, but these are some of them.
Well, I think
Uh,
that is important to the audience because most of the people that listen have at least been exposed to the ideas, and they're probably in the same situation as you and I, and that is trying to figure out why more people aren't interested in them.
don't see it, yeah, or
And
reject it.
that does kind of lead me to the question about how did you first learn of binary economics and Louis Kelso?
Well, that's a great question. I was one of those people who very early on, probably because of my work of my mother and helping disadvantaged people, it was just always in my blood to um, to be concerned about the people who were disadvantaged, and it became clear to me pretty young age that it was economic disadvantage that was the big disadvantage, the transcendent disadvantage. Now, I will say that race is another disadvantage in a racist society, and there are others. There are other biases too, and I do think that even if we could wave a wand and solve all the economic problems, we'd still have problems of prejudice by race and gender and other kinds of things, disability.
Right.
But economics was the transcendent one, and I was working with a large capitalist law firm. It was called Morrison and Foerster. It's still large, and I think I was the 69th attorney hired, and then that was many years ago, and now I think they have a couple of thousand attorneys. I mean, these law firms have become law factories. But I was in the tax department, and I just felt I was making rich people richer without much regard to this, social consequences to the poor. And I told my managing partner who I was reporting to, and he said, why would you want to leave a, blue blood firm like this? You got it made." I said, and I explained that I think because I'm concerned about the poor and the middle class people. And he said, well, if you're concerned about them, you ought to meet Louis Kelso, who was a client of mine, he said.
Oh, okay,
And,
okay.
and so I met Louis Kelso, listened to him talk, read his book, Two Factory Theory, and I was sold. It was that now. But I wasn't one of the, I read it, but I learned it from him. I learned so I worked about 5.5 years with him before I started teaching because I felt that teaching was the way that this idea really needed to go forward. Teaching, he was trying to implement it, and I think implementing it is good. The CESJ, they're implementers. There are others, but I think teaching is in a way more fundamental. That's my contribution. I'm a teacher, and I teach the idea, and so that's how I met him. He was wonderful. He was a genius. He
R-
no doubt about his sincerity and dedication and commitment, and his lonely, lonely struggle for so many years. There was only
Right.
Lewis, no, only
True.
Lewis, and
Yep.
then there were a few more, but not enough.
Right. Right. I totally agree. From what I understand, Louis Kelso was all by himself, but it was a stroke of genius for him to get Mortimer Adler involved with writing his book. Did you happen to meet Adler?
I never met Adler, and Kelso had already written the Capitalist Manifesto before I knew him.
Okay.
I met him in 70, I guess about 1971, so that was quite a bit later. He had already done that work and convinced Mortimer Adler, and I don't know the story behind that. I do have the sense that Mortimer Adler, obviously was very taken by the idea. He really lent his name to it, but I don't know how that happened.
Right. Adler was very intelligent. Talk about how some intelligent people take to it and some don't.
Mm-hmm.
But he was definitely well respected as a philosopher.
Yes, and the other thing that's important to point out about his role is that he was the leader of what they called then Encyclopedia Britannica 3 and the leader of what they called the Great Ideas. So, in other words, he
Right.
was a connoisseur of the most important ideas in philosophy and in human knowledge, and of course in the 20th century. And I think
Right.
his lending his name to this. If you read the the preface to the Capitalist Manifesto, he wrote a preface to it. He basically said this is one of the most important ideas of the 20th century that is not widely recognized. And that,
Right.
by the way, it's an interesting thing, just an observation to tell your listeners who are proponents. One of the things I oftentimes try to explain to people, it's a simple notion, is that most of the ideas that people know about and, are understood at least by millions of people. I mean, give me an idea, and within the main, I mean, certain scientific ideas are not. I mean, the current state of, uh, gene therapy or something. I mean, certain scientific ideas are understood by a few thousand. But when you talk about a social idea, some way of helping poor and working people, some way of social justice, almost everything is understood at least by millions of people. But this idea,
Right.
whether you're Robert Ashford teaching it in school or whether you're just a member of CESJ trying to convince your friends and neighbors, it might be good to remind those people that, you're not talking about an idea that's understood by millions of people. And if they
That's right.
if they find it to be plausible, you realize you now find an idea plausible. You don't know if it's true or not, but it has the plausibility that it's understood at this point by only 2,000 or 3,000 people. I'd be surprised if more than 10,000 people have a really coherent understanding of the insights that Louis Kelso offered. So
I
tell from
agree.
one person to another to say that, so you can make a big difference. If you just convince 10 people of it, you will have increased the number of people who understand this idea significantly, far more than if
That's
you jump on an idea that's understood by a million people.
good
So,
point. Very good point. And I think if anyone could be credited with increasing those numbers, it's you. It kind of is amazing that you have done all that you have. And I guess one story that I'm interested in hearing is how you came to be associated with Syracuse and, teaching binary economics. And as I understand it, you deserve a recent congratulations for development. On Mike Graney's blog, he said that you recently moved the course into a credit course situation. So that's a big accomplishment. Is that right?
well, it is true that I think it's a big accomplishment. I don't know if it's being taught anywhere else. There's a long history to this. I started teaching in '78, and the first time I was allowed to teach this course as a credit course, this must have slipped by Michael Greeny, was in 1991. For a couple of years, 1991, 92, I was allowed to
Okay.
teach a course, and then there was a desert. People didn't feel it belonged in academia, or certainly felt it didn't belong in the law school. And then there was a desert, and then until 2007. And I've been teaching it as a credit course seminar in the law school since 2007. Um, it's not a heavily subscribed course. It's only open to Syracuse University people. It's not an online course.
Okay.
It was a struggle to uh, get it taught, and it's still a struggle in a sense to keep it taught because it is it's not a course that um, helps you get a job. I just have to be
Right.
honest about it. If a student writes a paper for my course and says, should I show it to my employer? I say, oh no, whatever you do, don't do that, because the idea is still outside the mainstream. And when you're looking for a job, you don't want to be outside the mainstream. So
Right.
law students are interested in getting jobs. They're at the tail end of their education. This next, to get a job, or um, but a new event that recently, with support I've gotten from leaders within the university, I'm teaching it as a one credit honors course in the honors program, which is a very excellent
Okay,
honors
that must be
program
the
at Syracuse
change.
University. That's new, and
That must be the new development.
and that wasn't a struggle in the sense that I never asked for it, but once one of the people who are influential in that program, actually the founder of the program, heard me deliver a lecture, he said this really belongs in the honors program. And then the honors people heard another lecture of mine, and on the spot they offered me a credit course, and this next year will be the next time I'm teaching it, and the the students loved it. Their only complaint was that they didn't learn more about it. They said,
Wow.
you should
I
have taught
agree
us
with
more.
that. That's
And so
great.
the next
Well,
next
hats
year's
off to
course will be a little
Syracuse.
harder. Well, that's right. That's right. And it's slowly beginning, and it may be. I have the sense that there may be a slow, but maybe increasing openness to it. Part of the openness, by the way, is something. It's a symptom of the economy that is unaddressed by the present approaches, and that is, it's all encapsulated in the question: how will people earn in the age of the robots?
Right.
And there are emerging three basic approaches. One is universal basic income, a guaranteed income, which is a form
Right.
of redistribution.
Yep.
The second approach is the go back to the 30s. The government is the employer of last resort, jobs for all. And
Right.
I think that makes sense. And the third one is uh, broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital, which is the binary approach. Those are the three basic mechanisms.
Right.
And so, in that sense, and because it does not require a redistribution, whereas the other two do an involuntary redistribution, because it can be done without redistribution. The binary approach is one that has, in some ways, more appeal, but the other two are far easily understood. Nobody needs to understand the concept of redistribution, and nobody needs to understand the concept of the government being the employer of last resort. I mean, that's right in the fabric of our political understanding. But you say, how about enabling everybody to acquire capital with the earnings of capital? Some people say, what do
They're
you
just
mean by
looking
that?
at you like you're crazy. What did he say?
Well, because they're taught that you need capital to acquire capital, and that's false. It's
Right. That's true.
one of those misconceptions. There are a pile of misconceptions. Even if binary economics were not accurate and true, and I think it is, the economics discipline itself is so piled with misunderstanding and misconception, even among its practitioners. I mean, some of them know it, some of them don't know it. But even if we had nothing else to offer, um, just to have an economically literate population, you need to reform the economics profession, and that ain't easy to do. I mean,
Right.
it's a very influential profession. It's the queen of, they call it the queen of the social sciences. There's not a council of anthropological advisors or a council of, sociological advisors or a council of psychological. There's a council of economic advisors.
Right.
That's the
That's true.
heavyweight social science. That's the influential one.
That's right.
And there's a credentialism that is played to that goes for. Now, of course, Adam Smith was not an economist. I mean, this didn't exist when the foundation was laid. And the neoclassical economists Walras and Marshall, Marshall in the English language, what they call partial equilibrium economics, and Leon Walras, the Frenchman who brought us general equilibrium, what they call neo. They weren't economists; they were political economists. And Keynes was a
Right.
mathematician, so the giants in the field were not economists. Although
True.
today, if you're not an economist and you try to say something, you say, "Well, you're not an economist." Well, neither was Keynes, neither was Walras, neither was um, uh, Marshall, neither was Smith. None of those people
Right.
were economists.
And about Keynes, I found that you can't really nail many economists down to say that they fully support the Keynesian theories. They talk about how we're using them, and it's almost like they think it's some sort of necessary evil, but they have some other slightly different version that they like better. So
Well,
it's
that's it. I can shed some light on that too, that most people are not aware of. I've written co-authored a book on the history of economic thought. What most people, and this is true whether binary economics is true or false. What most people understand to be Keynesian economics is actually a synthesis that Paul Samuelson and a guy named Hicks worked, harmonizing Keynes's approach to economics with the Leon Walras general equilibrium economics, harmonizing the two together. They're very
wow.
different. Keynes does not believe in Samuelson's what is taught. Now,
Ah.
I would lay a challenge, and I'm happy to be proven wrong. I believe that I could get all the PhDs in economics that are teaching around the country, put them in a room, give them a blank tablet of paper, and say, take 3 hours, explain the difference between Samuelson's approach to economics and Keynes' approach to Keynesian economics. And I would say that somewhere close to half, if not more, couldn't do it. Now, what that says to the general population, and if you'll allow me an aside, if we don't have a literate population, we have a crippled democracy. What that tells you is that what is offered as Keynesian economics is not Keynesian economics, and its differences are easy to understand.
Right.
Um, Samuelson believed that Keynes is right, that you need government intervention in the short run, but not the long run, because in the long run, Leon Walras is right. We'll get to equilibrium, full employment equilibrium. Keynes said, no, Leon Walras is wrong in both the short run and the long run. And there's a big difference between those two. Now, I don't care. There's two different issues. One issue is who's right, Samuelson or Keynes, and let the economists fight about that. That's okay with me. But don't call
Wow.
Samuelson's economics Keynesian economics. Don't defraud the public. Now that's another issue, and that is an issue quite independent of whether Lewis Kelso was right about his understanding about production, distribution, and employment. That's a whole totally separate issue. And
Wow.
we could have that, but that's not widely taught. Now there are economists that understand that, and the best group
Right.
is a group called the post Keynesians, and that's led up by an economist named Paul Davidson,
Right.
and they're called the post Keynesians. I've always I've told Paul, you made a mistake. You shouldn't call it post-Keynesian economics. You call it true Keynesian economics. But that's
Oh,
an issue.
wow.
That's an issue of packaging. So that's just an
Right.
aside. We haven't even started talking about binary economics yet. We're probably going for 20 minutes.
Right. But before we do, and while we're complimenting various institutions, I want to compliment Oxford for inviting you over recently. So you had a good time over there, right?
It was a good conference. There was an economist there named George Bitsakakis, who's got quite a pedigree. He's a mathematician and an economist who understood. He's the first economist that called the theory that I advance, grows out of Lewis's thinking, as a endogenous growth theory, and it is.
Yeah.
Lewis's insights provide the basis for a theory of, and that's a big sexy topic in economics because there are two kinds of ways of approaching growth. One is that it is exogenous, that is to say, technology is independent of economic principles and it comes in like an outside development. And the other group, and they're in the minority, say, no, we should be able to endogenously, within the operation of the market itself, predict growth. And one of the Lewis Kelso's insights leads to the recognition that a broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital will promote fuller employment. So it adds on to Keynes, fuller employment, and per capita growth. So it adds on to Smith. And he was the first economist to do that, and he hosted a conference, and we've got a number of people that are dealing with it, and so I guess if you gauge a conference on whether the host wants to do it again next year, he said yes, he did. So we may have further traction. We don't have traction at Harvard. We don't have traction at Yale. We don't have traction at Stanford or Columbia. But we do have traction at Oxford, LSE, London School of Economics, and Cambridge. A little bit of support there, and
Oh, that's
so there's
great.
some hope that maybe England, the UK, which is facing Brexit, may come to recognize that the binary approach creates consumers in your own economy, so you don't have to worry about exporting to other people. You can do it internally.
Right.
So that's one of the wonderful implications about Kelso's theory.
You're gaining traction in a lot of areas, and these recent publications also.
Well, there was a journal.
European Financial Review. It took me a minute to find this. Sorry.
Yeah, that was the first co-authored article. My brother Nicholas. It took me 40 years to get him to put his name on it. Thank you, Nick. And the middle co-author is a guy named Ralph Hall. And I would say,
right, and I've met Ralph. Yeah.
To my knowledge, Ralph is the second most dedicated. Maybe he's equally dedicated now. He is the second professor that I know with a tenure at a school who's dedicating his activities largely centered on binary economics. And
right.
After 40 years, I have a colleague. It's been a while.
Yeah, that's great.
He's the one. He's the one who got my brother, interested. I would say supportive of it. My brother brought him in as a research assistant to study it, and then when Ralph studied it, he came to the conclusion it's a special idea. One of the things, if an idea is a special idea, you can't do it justice by treating it as just another good idea.
True.
That diminishes it. If it's a special idea, it has to be treated specially. And I always know when people understand the idea. It's very easy. When they begin doing things out of the ordinary, then I know they understand the idea, because it's an idea out of the ordinary, and that's how you know when someone understands it. So.
Absolutely. And on the subject of generally the ideas, I wanted to say that a lot of the leading thinkers in binary economics may have slightly different views, and we talked about this, but that's healthy, and I think you probably agree that if we had an actual, maybe a politician who was talking about implementing these things, at least as far as I'm concerned, even if it was slightly different, but if it's the main, gist of what Kelso came up with, I mean, I would support the guy. I'd be out there campaigning night and day, So I think that's a good thing that everyone I've talked to, even though we have, slightly different views of some areas, that we all kind of agree with that,
It is true that the only proviso I would say is that it needs to be faithful to the idea and not to confuse the idea with other ideas, and that's the only proviso that I would suggest.
That's true. Well, we spent the whole time here talking around binary economics, but we haven't really talked about what you think is the essence of it. So maybe we'll say that and then sign off for now and continue next time.
Sounds good. To me, the essence is very simple, and that is the more broadly capital is acquired with the earnings of capital, that creates the prospect of more broadly distributed capital income in future years, and therefore more incentive to invest in capital and labor in earlier years. And that greater incentive is inspired by the fact that people are earning much more through their ownership, and they're able to buy many more products by reason of their capital ownership.
And makes sense to me, and that's kind of what you meant by per capita growth, right?
Yes, that is a big cause of per capita growth that the prior approaches to economic theory simply ignored. Didn't see it.
Well, that sounds like something.
And since they didn't see it and didn't deal with it, implicitly they denied it. So we have only austerity and stimulus to deal with. That's austerity with tighten the belt and stimulus with government spending. But there's a third way, broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. And that is the just third way.
You're right. It is. Way to use our terminology, because you can call it that and you can call it binary economics, but bottom line, it's what everyone needs to be paying more attention to. Well, I appreciate the opportunity so far, and we will continue it next time and get into some more issues. So we'll sign off for now. You can join CESJ by going to cesj.org and clicking on participate, and you can become a paying member for $25 per year, and also a student membership is $15 per year, and that qualifies you for discounts on our materials, such as books, which you can buy many of and distribute to your friends and family. And also, if you'd like to participate and comment on the podcast, feel free to call. I have a voicemail set up. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I'll play it on the podcast. The number is 678-719-2840. Own or be owned.